Right, okay, welcome to the next PowerPoint presentation in your exciting selection of homeworks that you have to complete. This one is for nature versus nurture, okay? Just a reminder to anybody that these YouTube videos are a supportive aspect. They're not the be all and the end all. They don't include all the information that you need at all. You must refer back to your dog book as well, and you must also look at the scanned pages that I sent around to the pink-haired girl. I moved between the two because some of the points are effective in some books and some of the points are effective in the other book as well. One book isn't sort of superior over the other, unfortunately, hence why we have access to both. So please bear that in mind, and please do go and start looking for information yourself on the internet as well. So a mixture of all kind of four areas. Use the YouTube clip to support you, but also use the dog book, and you have got access to the pink-haired girl book as well. The more information you have, the better you understand it, the more likely your grade's going to be very, very strong to show off to employers, to show off to universities, whatever it may be where you're hoping to go next, to kind of evidence to if you're wanting to stay on to the second year, if you're doing a year one qualification in something, to evidence to your subject tutors that you can work hard. So this is a specification. We're now on to the very middle. We have done 3 points: gender, culture and free will. We're on to nature, nurture, and then we have 3 on the other side: holism, ideographism, and ideographic and normothetic approach, and the ethical implications as well. Okay, so not much left to go. And then these are some of the examples, some of the questions. What I'd encourage you to do, as I always do, is to read through these, complete these, and then go and find the mark scheme video, which will be up very, very soon on YouTube as well, for you to have a look at and consider. So really basic ones: what is meant by nature and nurture, 2 marks, and then of course a 16-mark essay referring to this statement. So there's AO1 skill in there as well. And then there's another one here about concordance rates, so you want to be comfortable with concordance rates. So a couple of really simple things about AO1, the nature versus nurture. You've got nature, which is or the other side of it, which could be called nativism. Human behaviour is strongly influenced by innate factors, so things that we are born with. Okay, and this is where we could talk about heritability, and you need to know the definition of heritability, so genetic transmission of characteristics from one generation to the next, and this is where you look at concordance rates. If you just go back a bit to have a quick look at the specification, you can see that you need to be aware of the importance of heritability or hereditary and environment in determining behaviour, and also you need to be able to talk about the interactionist approach. We've already referred to the interactionist approach loads, so you should be comfortable with that one already, and you can use it in evaluations. You can consider it in any way that you want to. So heritability is the idea that we pass on our genetic material essentially from one generation to the next, and of course the way that we look at that is we can look at twin studies and we can study concordance rates. So again, saving you some time if you learn this in a high level of detail for this topic, then you also know it for the biological approach, and you can talk about that in detail. So of course you know that the concordance rates goes from 0 to 1. You've got MZ twins that share 100% of their DNA and DZ twins that share 50% of their DNA. Both sets of twins share 100% of their environment. So it's much like the IV. Everything else is standardized. The only thing that's different between each pair of twins, so twin A and twin B, is MZ and DZ twins, is that the IV, which would be sharing 100% of their DNA, or only sharing 50% of their DNA and their genetics, and that helps us piece apart the interaction of nature versus nurture. Or does it? So you want to consider that in your AO3 as well. I wouldn't ever refer to the difference between MZ and DZ twins as an IV, because it's not an experiment that we're conducting. However, that is a useful way to think about it. And then we have there the example: there's MZ twins, which say schizophrenia and MZ twins concordance rate, so the likelihood that if one twin has it, the other twin has it as well. So consistently I see people not explaining what concordance rates are, and either therefore clearly not understanding them, or understanding them but because they don't make it really, really clear, they don't explain, kind of give a clear overt definition, then unfortunately they can't be credited for knowledge that they actually have. So don't waste that opportunity. So schizophrenia, MZ twins, between 40 and 50% concordance rate, which is interesting because I know originally we looked at Fisher, we looked at the 50%, and the DZ is kind of accepted at 15%. However, there is, though we do also talk about 40 and 7%, so the idea that Fisher, which I want to say was conducted in the 30s or the 50s, very, very early piece of research, was found to be not inaccurate, but slightly lacking in reliability, perhaps. So, because it hasn't been replicated since in quite the same level, so exactly on 50, it's a very famous one. So if you have a look on the final slide, link on the final slides at the end, that's really interesting and something that you could refer to and talk about in your evaluation points potentially, and also just for general interest because it's important to have accurate scientific knowledge. And then you've got the example of the evolutionary approach, and you could talk about Bowlby and you could talk about sexual selection. Both of those you already know about. So you know about Buss with sexual selection, the universal laws. Men prefer women that are younger than them. Women prefer men that are well resourced, and then both like intelligent and kind children. And also you've got the idea of Bowlby and attachment and social releases and behaviours that innate behaviours. So you can talk all about that, which you referred to with Andy. Evolutionary approach, extremely important thing. A lot of people, for example, if we talk about, say, ideally it's better to use human behaviours, but say if we use peppered moths as an example, the idea that, as you hopefully you all can remember from GCSE biology, so originally they were mostly white, lightly coloured moths. However, the Industrial Revolution happened in London, and very quickly all of the buildings became very dark and black and sooty, and the animals evolved. So the animals that were white stood out on the buildings and they died because they were eaten by the animals, whereas the animals who evolved became sooty, became dark, the peppered moth became dark, they survived. Lots of people under air, that is not enough to be credit worthy. So don't just explain that some survive and some die and some survive because of an adaptive trait or not having the adaptive trait. So that's another key term that you need to be aware of. Please refresh your memory of all of these, but you must take it on to the further point. Well, so what if they survive, or so what if they die? Well, if they survive, then they're able to go on to reproduce and pass on that genetic propensity towards whatever it might be. So in this case, having darker mothy wings than lighter mothy wings. They can pass that genetic propensity onto their offspring, whereas adaptive traits, if you die, you're not able to pass on that adaptive trait. Well, it's not an adaptive trait, is it? Sorry, if you die, then you don't pass on the trait, so that's why we find we have less lightly coloured moths, because they died out so quickly. And the same with Buss and sexual selection. So I already spoke about this in the revision sessions with quite a few people, but sexual selection, the idea that so men would go for women who are younger than them. This is because their window of fertility is available for longer, increasing the likelihood that they will be able to reproduce. So suggesting that genetic material will be passed on to their children, who will then also find male children who will also find people younger than them attractive. So it's an adaptive trait. You need to mention that passing on of genetics bit. Whereas obviously those who find women who aren't fertile attractive, not going to be able to pass on the genetics, so that trait is going to die out. They can't pass on that gene for less fertile older women, shall we say? Anyway, moving on from that quickly. You've got nurture and you've got empiricists. So they believe that human behaviour is influenced by environmental factors. And it's one of my favourite phrases, although it isn't necessarily something I agree with, tabula rasa. So the idea that we are born a blank slate and that we learn every single one of our behaviours. And already you should be thinking about which approaches do you already know something about. So don't try and learn something new. Think about things you already know and tell me about those. So we've got levels of environment. So nurture empiricists, or people who believe in the nurture side of the debate, acknowledge there are different levels of environment. It starts all the way from prenatal, so before children are born, that is environmental. So if we're talking about the mother smoking before the child is born, that is something that could be viewed as nurture. It's something to do with the environment, or if they take drugs, or if they eat healthily, or whatever it might be. And then that can move all the way up, so increase all the levels. And there is some notes in your cat book and your green-haired girl book, or pink-haired girl book, I suppose, about that all the way up to the cultural and historical context. So nurture covers a huge range of information. And there you go, you have two examples. So you have attachment. So before Bowlby, there was the behaviourists who believed that we learnt all of our attachment behaviours. You could talk about classical and operant conditioning. Please don't forget to link it back to human behaviour. Don't just focus on Pavlov and Skinner and the dogs. Link it back to human stuff. And then another example would be social learning theory. So we do learn from our environment and things around us, so vicarious reinforcement and so on. So in your books you can see you've got to debate between the two pieces of information, so tell me about nature, tell me about nurture, and kind of compare those. And then you have the evaluation points, and there's quite a few. As always, hopefully you've noticed by now, the next one is the negative impact of the debate. So if we focus too strongly on one side of the debate, or if research is gender bias, or if research is cultural bias, then there is always a negative impact to that. So you saw with free will and determinism how it was negative because they could deny responsibility. Oh no, I didn't have any choice. I had to kill that person because my genes told me to. Or denial of treatment. Oh no. If your depression is caused by your depression, because I'm a determinist, I believe that's caused by this biological influence. So you can only have access to biological treatments. When, as we know, things like cognitive behavioural therapy, so working on developing and changing the way that people think, which wouldn't be deterministic, there wasn't access to. The negative impact of the nature virtue debate can be explored in two ways. So you can, and I would encourage you, so when I ask you to do the evaluation points in class, I'd encourage you to be able to talk about both. So you could say that a weakness of considering of the nature versus nurture debate, or kind of an issue with the way that it's discussed, is there is negative impact of the debate if you lean more to one or to the other. So if you take a non-interactionalist approach, so you view that one is more important, or that one is key and one isn't, and the negative impact of that, of course, would be eugenics and IQ. So thinking about, and that information is in, let me just have a quick look, I think it is in the dog book. Possibly it's in the green-haired girl. I can't see quick enough. I think it is in the green-haired girl. But eugenics, so the idea that you are born with certain behaviours that then lead to you displaying that behaviour. So if you think about genome and phenotype, so eugenics, you are born with a certain level of intelligence. So eugenics was the idea that people who had a certain level of IQ or various other things should not be allowed to go on and have children. So people were sterilised, and you could talk about loads of different times when that's happened in history, such as the Nazis in world wars and things. So it's quite a dangerous thing to happen. To believe that it's all due to nature, then that's the suggestion that we shouldn't allow people with certain genetic traits to breed, and we should, and sometimes that can lead on obviously to discrimination that involves killing them as well. And then behaviour shaping, and I think for nurture, so the idea is if everything is due to our environment, then we can shape all of the behaviours, and that could be twofold. So the idea that we could use that for social control, so we could put in place environmental stimulus or whatever it may be to control the behaviours. But also, I suppose a really, really good link for this one would be, I don't know if it is aversion therapy, I think it might be that it's referred to, so this idea of therapies that are provided to turn people straight, because the assumption is, if you talk about nurture, that the reason that people are homosexual is because of their environment and nothing else. The same with loads and loads of other behaviours. Is what could be believed. So if that was the case, it can be very dangerous, because the idea could be that we, so if we just provide them with punishment, so of course reinforcement increases behaviour, punishment decreases the behaviour. If we provide them with punishment stimulus, then that whole behaviour should be removed. So it's incredibly dangerous to consider. And of course, so there's the negative impacts of it, and then of course you can say some, I can't remember who it was, but some really excellent suggestions about the idea that if psychology becomes wrapped up with those kind of concepts, that it's it then becomes unappealing to people, sort of things they want to avoid. Then you also have the interactionist approach, so we've spoken about that loads, but now you have to know it because it's named on the specification, particularly to do with nature versus nurture, so it could be a question that's asked. And it's all about the interaction between nature and nurture. So it's not, is it nature or is it nurture, but it's how much of nature is it, how much of nurture is it. And you could talk about 3 different examples, and you've got tons of different things you could talk about there in the cat and the dog book. So the diathesis stress model, which we've spoken about before, so the idea of, and we use the analogy of a bucket, I think it is. So the idea that we have a genetic propensity towards a certain mental health condition or whatever it may be, and then it requires stimulation or sort of certain stimuli from the environment. So if we're genetically vulnerable to schizophrenia, and then if we experience something within our kind of early early 20s, late teens, then that is more likely to make us schizophrenic. Whereas if we have the genetic propensity and we don't experience any kind of stressful or unpleasant life events, then that window is lost and we might not develop schizophrenia. The same with if enough, even without the genetic propensity, if there's enough stressful life events, then we could develop schizophrenia. Or if the genetic propensity is extremely strong, then it would only take a very small number of kind of environmental stimulus to cause schizophrenia to happen. I've also got neuroplasticity, so you're all aware of brain plasticity, so the idea that the brain kind of responds to the environment, and something we haven't looked at that I would highly encourage you to, because you can use it in both topics, is Maguire. So he looks at taxi drivers and the idea that their brain structure alters because of their experiences within their life. So again, it's showing how nature and nurture interact. And there's a really, really interesting page on nature affecting nurture and nurture affecting nature in the dog book. And also, I think the Green-haired girl book's okay for this one as well. So reactive gene, passive influence, and active influence. So reactive gene is the idea that if a child is more aggressive, then people are more likely to respond to them in aggressive manners. So that's one influence. Then there's a passive influence. So parents' genes influence aspects of their behaviour. So passive, the child has no control of it. But for example, if the parent is experiencing substance abuse issues, then they might not provide the care needed. And then active influence, which is a bit like niche picking, which is a really fantastic and interesting piece of research. I think the idea that children go out and seek environments which support them. So I think the example I found, and there's some really good links on the final PowerPoint slide, even if I do say so myself because I put them there, about the idea that if a child is an extrovert, they might seek out others who are also extrovert, which would influence our behaviour and our genetics. And so, or obviously introvert, they would avoid that from happening. And then epigenetics, which is a really fascinating area of research. That's another one that you consider, and that is the idea that there are markers on the DNA. So the DNA structure can't really change. However, there are markers on it which kind of like are viewed as on or off switches. So the DNA is always there, but how much a certain part of the DNA works involves whether a switch is on or off within the DNA. And that is influenced by environment as well, and it can be influenced by previous generations. So the CAT book has it on the AO1 side of the page, and it argues that it's not necessarily about considering what our nature is like, but also our nurture, what our environment is like, but also previous generations' experiences as well. And you've got the idea that mice, if they were shocked regularly when they smelt perfume, unsurprisingly learnt that, so that is part of the nature debate. However, other mice who don't have that experience, their offspring do not then also experience that kind of fear of perfume, whereas mice who've had that experience, their children experience that behaviour and that response as well, to be shocked by the perfume. So mice generally naturally aren't surprised or scared by perfumes. However, mice can be trained to do that, which isn't particularly surprising. What is surprising is that can be passed on to their genetically through their offspring. So it's not necessarily automatically innate behaviour, but it's learned and then becomes innate. And then you can talk all about epigenetics. The Guardian article is excellent. I'll put all of those links in the comments section as well. And the Guardian article talks about the idea that DNA is sort of an instruction manual, and then the markers are different colours of highlighters, sort of suggesting this bit is important at the moment and this bit isn't important at the moment. So the DNA is still exactly the same, but everybody's kind of way they highlight and mark DNA is different. Really, really fascinating. And then methodological issues. So, of course, nature versus nurture relies heavily on twin studies, and you could talk about shared and unshared environments, contamination effect, match families, and generalizability. And a lot of that is in the psychology wizard and also in the different books as well. And I'd highly encourage you doing that because there's so many different things you can evaluate twin studies for. So the idea that just because two MZ twins live together doesn't mean they experience exactly the same environment. So all DZ twins twins. So we're relying on the fact that everything's standardised. The only thing that changes is whether the twin has 100% DNA or 50% DNA, whereas in fact it could, and their environments are identical, whereas in fact their environments could be altered too. So that's something to consider. Contamination effect. So adoption studies are something else they look at, where they look at people who are adopted. They compare their behaviours to their biological parents and their adoptive parents. If it's biological parents, then it's a biological influence, whereas if it's adoptive parents, then it must be nurture. And there's contamination effect. So generally children aren't, or not all children are automatically removed from the families and adopted. So there is a period of time when the children are in their families, their biological families, so they experience both biological families and also the nurture of the biological family, so we can't really tease it apart. And of course you can, as you know, there's different levels of explanation, so prenatal environment also has a factor as well. So they try and match families on similarities, which is something that somebody previously mentioned to me the other day, which is a very good point. That they match when they're adopting families, they match them. So it not only is it nature, but again the nurture is similar too. And then generalizability. It's very small and unique samples. So twin studies, adoption studies, twins that are raised apart, all of that are very small and very, very different. And of course there are usually, not always, but usually some kind of difficult circumstances within adoption, particularly if they've experienced that slightly unpleasant idea of contamination effect. So it's not very named very nice. It's not a very nice name. That they sort of still spent some previous time with their biological families, which might be what we could describe as chaotic. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the Psychology Wizard. Do not forget to link it back to the theory, otherwise the examiner will just sit there and think, well, I don't really care what's the problem with twin studies. You must make it clear that a problem with trying to tease apart nature and nurture, it relies a lot on the use of twin studies and adoption studies. These are other problems with those studies. What's the problem with a study with theories that are based on poorly researched and poorly conducted research as well? So please link that back. Now, I did some marking. I looked at the mark scheme, and they suggested this was some of the key terminology you need to be aware of. So it's not from the specimen paper, sorry, from the spec. It won't be specifically guaranteed there'll be a question asked on it. However, if you understand all of these key pieces of terminology, it will make your life so much easier. So nativism, which we've already looked at, empiricism, which we've already looked at, interactionalism, which we've already looked at, shared and non-shared environments. We've looked at pre- and postnatal environments. So before the child was born, when the mother was pregnant, after the child was born, when the mother was no longer pregnant, obviously. Active and passive environments, so the idea that environments, not only, they're not passive, they don't just happen, but the children also has an influence on them as well. And heritability coefficients, methods of research used in relation to the debate, so twin studies, understanding of different approaches in psychology in relation to the debates. Don't learn anything new, just sit down, create a continuum, whatever it might be. Nature versus nurture, which we've already done. I'm in fact looking at them now because I'm sat in room 268. And then you can tell me, so you're not learning anything new with these, you're just applying knowledge that's previously there. So that's it really. There, I would encourage you to be aware of all that key terminology, even though you don't have to be. It makes your life so much easier. Here are some suggestions of tasks you could complete. Might give you time to do those in class. If not, there's still really useful ones. So create a continuum, exactly like I explained. Where does nature and nurture, where do they sit? Create another continuum. So the first one was for the approaches. And then this time I would do one for year 1 and year 2 topics as well. So it's not necessarily the approaches, but of course you looked at attachment with Andy, you've looked at explanations and treatments of psychopathology with me. So I would have another continuum on there as well. So your wall can be nice and full in your house, in your room, wherever you want it to be, with lots and lots of lovely continuums and kind of visual aids. A really useful thing might be to create a continuum with post-it notes, take a picture of it, keep that picture safe, take the post-it notes off, next day go and try and put them on, and then compare them. So think, are they in the correct place? Have I got them right? So it's about testing it. Take them off again. There you go. That's your revision done. That's far more interesting and more fun than copying out notes. I create a glossary of key terms with examples attached to each key term. So you've got loads of key terms in here. Can you link an example to each one? Then you could photocopy it, cut it. Then you can photocopy it, cut it apart, and then you could do it as a matching activity, check it against your original answers, plan, write in time conditions, check using YouTube, mark and identify areas for development, then bring to me. So I've not had anybody do that quite yet. I've had lots of people complete the 30 mark essays, which is excellent. But what else I'd like you to do is plan and write your exam questions, the ones at the beginning of the YouTube clip, this YouTube clip. Check them using the YouTube video that I'll upload soon, and then mark them, discuss them with your tutor. And write a model essay, so using loads of detail, loads of books, write a model essay, create a bullet pointed plan, and turn them into flashcards. So you could have all of the exam questions spread out in front of you and think, right now, if I was given a 16-mark question on, in this case, nature versus nurture, in AO1 I'd talk about this, this, and this. In AO2, 3 I'd talk about this, this, and this. Right, have I missed anything? Oh yeah, no, that's good. Or oh yeah, I've got a couple more to go. So you put that one back, do a couple of other ones, cultural bias, gender bias, come back to that one, think, now what was that information? Oh yes, I remember, the thing I missed out was this. There we go, ta-da. Simple as that. Create a list of questions and answers and get somebody to test you. And then if you'd like to, you can have a debate with somebody from class or home about nature versus nurture. What do you really think? So of course in psychology you need to talk about how it's interactionalist. However, it might be useful to try and convince somebody if you do have a particular standpoint. So if you think it's nature, you think it's nurture. It's always an interesting area. So I'm sure that people at home or people from other subjects, you can educate them into the joys of psychology as well. And there we go, we have some additional links. So it's 5 minutes and 52 seconds in, you can have a look at that video, and it moves on to the diathesis stress model. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that one. There's loads of really interesting, there's a journal article here that's an abstract you can have a read of, and there's a tutor to use stuff which is brilliant. The notes are fantastic, and they have a webinar, so if you're fed up of my voice you can listen to somebody else blabber on about it instead. There's some information about active and passive environments in there, and niche picking. I'll put all of those links in the YouTube in the comments section below as well. Just in case you want to have a look at any of those, I'd highly encourage them, along with the links from previous videos. That is it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've particularly enjoyed this completing this part of your homework task, and I look forward to talking to you about it in session. Don't forget, if there's anything you're not sure of, probably the easiest thing to do now after you've made all your notes is write down a list of everything you're not sure of. So think, I don't understand this key term, or I want to check this evaluation point. And then of course in class I will always ask you, has anyone got any questions, and that would be a great time for me to see you pull out that list of questions and say, yes, I'm not sure of this, this and this. If you want to get in touch with me before, you're welcome to, and of course if you'd like to share anything, ask any questions in the comments section, then I'll try and get back to you, or you can send me an email.